My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I work the night shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere along Route 66. If you've ever driven down those empty roads in the dead of night, you know how lonely it can get. Miles of darkness, interrupted only by rusty signs and faintly blinking neon lights. But this station is different from the others. I found that out on my first night. My boss, an old guy named Marty, threw a bunch of keys into my hand and said only two things. If you want to stay alive, follow the rules. And don't ask questions. He pointed to a piece of yellowed paper, taped to the counter with old Scotch tape. I thought it was a to-do list, but when I read it, I realized there was nothing normal about it. Rules for the night shift. 1. If a black car with no plate stops at 3:17 a.m., do not make eye contact. Don't try to look inside. Just keep doing your job until it leaves. 2. If you hear knocks on the supply room door after midnight, don't open it. They stop after a while. 3. If an elderly man walks up and asks to use the phone, ask him, "What's your trip?" If he answers the end of the line, turn off all the lights and hide. 4. Never leave the station between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. 5. If someone who looks like you comes into the station, pretend you didn't see them and go to the back until they leave. 6. If the store TV starts showing static, turn it off immediately and don't look at the screen until you're sure it's back to normal. 7. If, at any point during the night, you realize you're not alone, ignore it. They don't like attention. Is this some kind of prank? I asked, trying to laugh it off. Marty just gave me a tired look, like he'd heard this before. Follow the rules and everything will be fine, he repeated, before grabbing his coat and walking out the front door, leaving me alone at the station, lit only by the fluorescent lights. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just some bizarre initiation to freak out the new guys. But something in the way Marty spoke unsettled me. He wasn't joking. That first night, I sat behind the counter, trying to ignore the yellowed paper beside me. I wanted to prove it was all nonsense. Then, at 11:45 p.m., I heard the first knock on the supply room door. 1, 2, 3. I glanced at the security monitors, but the camera for the back was down. The supply room was small, and I knew no one had gone in there. The sound kept going, rhythmic, insistent. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand reached for the doorknob, but then I remembered the second rule. If you hear knocks on the supply room door after midnight, don't open it. They stop after a while. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. 11:59 p.m. If I opened the door right then, would I be breaking a rule? I took a deep breath and waited. At 12:01 a.m., the knocking stopped. I was alone again. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The first night ended without any further incidents, but I couldn't sleep right when I got home. The sound of those knocks on the supply room door still echoed in my head. The next day, when I returned to work, Marty was waiting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine. He shot me a sideways glance. "You made it through," he said, without looking up. "The knocks, does this happen every night?" I asked. Marty closed the magazine and snorted. "You heard them, huh? But you didn't open the door." "That's good." He didn't explain anything else. He just tossed a bag of coffee on the counter and walked out, leaving me alone again. At 3 a.m., the station was drowned in silence. Outside, the darkness seemed thicker than usual. I tried distracting myself with my phone, but the signal was terrible in that area. That's when I saw the headlights. A black car appeared on the empty road, slowly coming toward me. I already knew what that meant. Rule 1. If a black car with no plate stops at 3:17 a.m., do not make eye contact. Don't try to look inside. Just keep doing your job until it leaves. My heart started to race. I grabbed my wristwatch and checked the time. 3:16 a.m. The car moved closer, as if testing my patience. Its headlights cast a yellowish glow on the gas station's display window, making my shadow stretch out on the ground. I lower my head and pretended to be organizing some packs of gum on the counter. 3:17 a.m. The engine cut off. I heard the car door open. My body tensed. I wanted to look to know who or what was stepping out of that vehicle. But the rule was clear: don't make eye contact. Footsteps echoed on the cement floor. Someone entered the station. I could feel their presence. The air grew heavy, as if the pressure inside the store had increased. My eyes were glued to the counter, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The sound of something wet and sticky dripping onto the floor made me hold my breath. Then the thing spoke. "Get me a coffee." My throat went dry. The voice was deep, distorted, like it was being filtered through an old machine. I turned my back to the shelf and grabbed a disposable cup, doing my best not to look at the reflection in the window in front of me. My fingers were trembling. I poured the coffee, put the lid on, and pushed the cup across the counter. "Here you go." A pause. Then the hand took the cup. I caught a glimpse. It was wrong. The fingers were too long, pale like melted wax. The nails were cracked and filthy, like the thing had dug something or someone up from beneath the earth. "Thanks," the voice said. The creature turned and left the store. The car engine roared. The headlights shone again. The vehicle took off, disappearing down the road. I looked at the clock. 3:18 a.m. I had followed the rule, but when I bent down to grab a cloth and clean the spot on the floor where the thing had stood, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark footprint. It wasn't mud. It was blood. The rest of the night dragged on. Time seemed to move unnaturally after the black car left. With every passing minute, I felt a strange weight in the air, as if something was still there watching me. When Marty came in for the morning shift, he immediately noticed my state. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked, furrowing his brow. I followed the rule. "I didn't look inside the car," I answered hesitantly. He sighed and shook his head. "You shouldn't have even tried to look at the footprint. Some things are better left unanswered." I wanted to ask more, but Marty just shot me a serious look before turning away and starting to restock the snacks on the shelves. The next night, I was more prepared. I did everything Marty said. I ignored the supply room, kept my head down when the headlights of the black car appeared, and cleaned up any strange marks on the floor without looking too closely. It was around 4 a.m. when something new happened. Outside the station, there was an old, abandoned playground. The rusted structure barely stood upright, and the swings creaked with the slightest breeze. No one ever used that place. But that night, I saw someone sitting on the swing. Rule 4. If you see a man sitting on the swing at 4 a.m., don't talk to him. If he calls you, pretend you didn't hear him. My heart skipped a beat. The man was there. I couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, but he was thin, wearing ragged clothes, and gently swaying back and forth. The creaking of the swing cut through the silence of the night. I squinted my eyes and kept cleaning the counter, trying to ignore him. But then, hey, a chill ran down my spine. The voice was weak, almost a whisper, but clear enough to cut through the glass barrier of the store and reach me. "Can you help me?" My throat went dry. I forced myself to keep cleaning. "I know you can hear me." The voice insisted, even quieter. I didn't answer. I didn't look. I didn't move. "I just need a minute of your attention." The creaking of the swing stopped abruptly. My heart skipped a beat. I still hadn't looked at him. I hadn't said anything. So, I was safe, right? But then, something happened. A loud bang on the store's glass door. Bam! I jumped back. Bam! 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 The glass rattled. My eyes immediately shot to the entrance. Nothing. There was no one there. I looked back at the playground. The swing was empty. The man had vanished. My breathing was out of control, my chest rising and falling too quickly. That's when I noticed something. glass door. There were handprints on it, pale, bony hands, turned the wrong way, as if the thumbs were in the wrong place. I couldn't stay inside anymore. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door. I stayed there until the sun came up. When Marty arrived for the morning shift, he found me pale, leaning against the bathroom wall, shaking. He didn't ask anything. He just handed me a coffee and gave me a pat on the shoulder. "You're doing fine," he said. "Just a few more nights and you'll get used to it." But I wasn't sure I wanted to get used to it. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe it was exhaustion or a cruel trick of the darkness and my imagination. But the handprints on the glass were still there in the morning. Marty cleaned them without saying a word, as if he was already used to it. That night, I showed up for my shift trying to keep calm. I'd follow all the rules. I wouldn't look at the black car. I wouldn't talk to the man on the swing. And most importantly, I wouldn't ask questions. But then, another rule came into play. Rule 5. If someone walks into the store and you notice their reflection in the mirror doesn't match their movements, do not show that you noticed. Just act normal and let them leave. I'd read that rule before, but I never thought I'd actually have to follow it. It was around 3 a.m. when a man walked in. At first glance, he seemed normal enough. Wrinkled button-down shirt, worn-out jeans, eyes hollow from not having slept in days. But there was something about him that made me uneasy. He walked straight to the fridge and grabbed a bottle of soda. He put it on the counter without saying a word. "Anything else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He slowly shook his head. That's when, out of reflex, I glanced at the mirror behind me, where I could see the aisle of the store. My stomach churned. The man was still standing in front of the counter, but in the reflection, he was facing me. The eyes in the reflection were locked on mine. The real customer was still staring at the soda, waiting for me to ring him up. I swallowed hard. Don't let him know you noticed. I kept my expression neutral and scanned the barcode. That's $3.50. The man pulled a bill from his pocket and set it on the counter. In the mirror, his reflection smiled, but the man in front of me didn't flinch. My hands trembled slightly as I handed him the change. "Have a good night," I murmured. The customer grabbed the soda and walked out the door, but the reflection stayed for a few more seconds, frozen, staring directly at me. And then, slowly, it waved. It was a small, subtle gesture, but it felt loaded with some hidden meaning. After that, it disappeared. I turned toward the door. The customer was already crossing the parking lot, walking into the darkness of the road. My legs felt weak. I needed a cigarette, even though I didn't smoke. I knew this gas station wasn't normal. I knew Marty and the other attendants had secrets they'd never share. But for the first time, I wondered if this place was trying to test me, or worse, if it was trying to turn me into something different. After the encounter with the man in the mirror, something changed in me. I spent the rest of the shift restless, feeling like someone was watching me, even when the store was empty. When Marty showed up in the morning, I looked at him, expecting some sort of explanation, but all he did was throw a cloth over the counter and say, "You handled him well." That confirmed what I had already feared. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something deeply wrong with that place. That night, as I was going over the rules before starting my shift, my eyes stopped on one that had seemed harmless until then. Rule 6. If a car stops at the pump with no one inside, and the pump starts fueling on its own, do not interfere. Just watch until it's done and mark the amount as paid on the sheet. I laughed without humor. After everything I'd already seen, that didn't seem so absurd. But at 1:42 a.m., I found out it was much worse than I imagined. I was leaning on the counter when I heard the beep of the pump activating. I looked outside and saw a car stop by the fuel pump, but there was no one inside. The driver's door was open, the seat empty. Still, the pump was fueling. Gasoline was flowing, the numbers on the display ticking up as if someone were there, holding the trigger. My breathing became heavy. Don't interfere. Just watch. Slowly, I started to notice something strange on the rear window of the car. A shadow, a reflection. Someone was sitting in the back seat. My heart raced. The faint light from the street lamps illuminated a pale face, with hollow eyes and an empty expression. The head was slightly tilted, as if it was watching me. I tried to keep my gaze fixed on the pump, pretending I hadn't seen anything. The gasoline kept flowing. Time seemed to drag on. Then, a cold sound sliced through the silence of the night. The passenger door opened by itself. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't move. The front seat remained empty. But now, the back door was open as well. Had the passenger gotten out of the car? I tried to control my breathing. The numbers on the pump finally stopped. The passenger door slowly closed. The driver's door followed suit. The car stayed there for a few seconds, the engine running. And then, without hurry, it sped off. It vanished down the empty road of Route 66. I stood there, frozen, staring at the dust trail it left behind. Had anyone else seen that besides me? Had Marty witnessed the scene before? My head spun with questions, but deep down, I knew the answer. I'd never know who or what had been in that car, and maybe that was for the best. The night dragged on after the incident with the ghost car. I wanted to believe it was all just a nightmare, a delirium brought on by exhaustion. But I knew the truth. There were things at this gas station that defied any logical explanation, and the worst was yet to come. I spent the rest of my shift trying not to look too much at the mirrors, at the cars that passed too slowly on the road, or at the empty swing across the street. And then at 3:33 a.m., he appeared. I didn't see him arrive. He was just there, tall, thin, wearing a tattered overcoat. His face was gaunt, skin incredibly pale, eyes hollow and lifeless. He stood outside the store, staring directly at me through the glass. I froze. There was no mention of him in the rules. Should I ignore him? Should I talk to Marty? Before I could make up my mind, he entered. His steps were silent, as if he were gliding across the floor. He walked slowly up to the counter and just stood there, watching me. "Can I help?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The silence was absolute. His presence seemed to absorb all sound around us. "Sir?" He blinked slowly, as if processing my words. Then, with a low, dry voice, he murmured, "I'm waiting." A chill ran down my spine. Waiting for what? He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me. Every second seemed to stretch into hours. My mouth was dry. My hands trembled slightly. Then he smiled. It was a small, subtle smile, but completely wrong. And then he said something that took my breath away. "You shouldn't be here." My mind spiraled. Before I could ask what he meant, the store door opened by itself. A cold wind swept through the space, and when I blinked, he was gone. I scanned the store with my eyes, my heart pounding against my chest. But he had vanished. I ran to the door and looked out at the parking lot. Nothing. No sign of him on the road. It was as if he had never existed. I took a deep breath and went back inside, trying to calm myself. But as I passed a bulletin board where the rules were posted, something made me stop. Rule 7 was different. The handwriting was shaky, as if it had been altered recently. Before, it read, "Rule 7. Never leave the station before dawn, no matter what you hear or see." But now, a new line had been added right underneath. If a man in a trench coat enters the store and says he's waiting, leave. Leave immediately. My blood ran cold. Someone or something had rewritten the rule while I was there. And if that happened, it meant it was still watching me. It was as if the gas station had its eyes on me. Every move I made, every step I took, was being watched by something invisible, something that knew me better than I knew myself. And now, with the newly added rule, I didn't know if I was more afraid of what could happen or what had already happened. The clock read 4:30 a.m. I still had a few hours until dawn, but time felt like it was stretching, as if it were being warped by some force beyond my understanding. I needed to leave, but the rules, those damn rules, and Rule 8, one that had never been mentioned before, was now there in red letters, as if it had been printed in a hurry. Rule 8, don't seek explanations. When the station calls for you, just leave. Call for me? How could that even be possible? The sound of an engine made my body tense. I looked out the window, and there it was, the car again. But this wasn't just any car. It was the same one that had stopped at the pump by itself that night. The car with no driver. I didn't want to go out there. My body refused to take another step toward the door. But for some reason, something was forcing me to walk toward the pump. When I got there, the car was parked again, the pump running, but this time, the gas wasn't flowing. The display on the pump was frozen. The number stuck. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. A man with a hollow expression, his eyes dull, but wearing that same creepy smile. He stared at me through the glass, and for the first time he spoke. It's no use. There's no going back now. My stomach twisted. His voice was rough, as if it had been distorted by the night itself. The sense of terror hit me all at once, but something else pushed me forward. An instinct I couldn't explain, like I was being drawn to him by some irresistible force. I didn't want to hear anything more, but before I could turn away, I heard another sound, a phone ringing. The landline in the store was ringing, echoing through the dark silence of the night. My feet moved on their own toward the counter, and when I picked up the receiver, a strange voice on the other end almost made me drop the phone. You're close. They know you're close. There's no time. They're coming. Whatever I felt in that moment, it was the end. The feeling that I had reached the point of no return. Then, the man in the car spoke again. You knew the rules, and now they're a part of you. My mind began to swirl, the sound of the phone blending with the distant hum of the engine, the wind's howl, and something else. Something I couldn't put into words, but it was closing in on me. The darkness seemed to press in around me. And before I could react, one last sentence pierced my mind like a desperate scream. You're going to be the next to follow the rules. Silence took over. The car's engine turned off, and all that was left was the distant sound of the empty roads of Route 66 as the gas station prepared to call the next one.